is The Guardian.
Everyone, we've got about 5 minutes before the lockup starts. So I'll just give a bit of a rundown.
In just a moment, we're going to hand over our phones to the Treasury officials who are supervising the budget lockup.
You can't leave the lockup until the embargo is lifted without the permission of...
They'll then pass on the budget papers.
We've got Richard with your budget documents coming through SIG box at 1:30.
This budget will forecast a second consecutive surplus, we know that. But later, I'll be talking to Guardian Australia's Editor-in-Chief Lenore Taylor and our political editor Karen Middleton about this budget and how Labor is threading the needle between providing cost of living relief and not further stoking inflation.
That's all. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. I might start taking a look at the papers.
Mr. Speaker, this is a budget for the here and now, and it's a budget for the decades to come.
I'm Noor Haidar, coming to you from Gadigal land, and this is the full story. On Tuesday evening, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down the Albanese government's third budget.
A government and a budget for every Australian.
At its centre are the already legislated changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts, which come into effect this July.
The average benefit is $1,888 a year, which is $36 a week.
It also includes $300 energy rebates for all households, and nearly 1 million renters will get access to increased Commonwealth rent assistance.
And tonight I assure Australians that more help is on the way.
The government will spend an extra $2.2 billion to improve the state of aged care.
Speaker, as more Australians live longer and healthier lives, demand for our aged care services is growing, and the sort of care we need is changing.
And there's a multi-billion-dollar package to spur domestic manufacturing and speed up the path to net zero. But could this budget make stubbornly high inflation worse? And is it enough to help Labor secure a second term? Today, the economic and political story behind Labor's budget.
And that's why I commend this bill, Mr. Speaker, and this budget to the House.
It's Wednesday, the 15th of May. Hi there, Lenore.
Hi, Noor.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, Noor.
Hope the lockup went smoothly on your end in Canberra.
The best thing was that the Treasury official didn't judge us for our Tim Tam consumption, which we appreciated.
Ours didn't judge us for the jelly snakes.
All right, let's get into the budget. You've now both had time to sift through the papers. What jumped out at you, Lenore?
Well, it's pretty simple. This is a pre-election budget, and quite blatantly so. I think the government has spent as much as it thinks it can get away with without putting upward pressure on inflation and therefore interest rates. It's heavily weighted its spending on a lot of things, but in particular the sort of centrepiece measures of the budget to the next 12 months, which happens to be the period in which we expect an election. So, I think it's kind of a fairly simple budget to analyse. The government wants the cost of living crisis to feel a little bit less crisisy within a year.
Karen?
Yeah, well, if it's any less shameless than other governments' pre-election budgets, that's only because of the economic constraints that were on the Labor Party here. Basically, they have done, as Lenore said, as much as they could get away with to indicate to people that they feel their pain and they're giving them something back, but not so much as to overstimulate the economy and make the inflation problem worse.
So Jim Chalmers has said that the number one priority of this budget is helping Australians with the cost of living. What is new in that regard?
The new measure in that regard is the energy bill rebate, which is $300 for every single household, not means tested, $350 for small businesses. That costs an eye-watering $3.2 billion, and it's a one-off thing. So it comes off our power bills, if you like, over the next year. And that is where the rub of this balancing act between spending and not fueling inflation really becomes interesting, because the government says it can spend that money and have it actually be deflationary, actually reduce the CPI, which is, I think, going to be a point of debate after this budget.
The government's also handing out more rent assistance to people at the low end, and these are both measures that they took last year. So they've gone back to measures that they've done before, but in the case of the energy rebate, they've expanded it to everybody. And the reason they've taken the risk with using these two particular measures is that the Bureau of Statistics and the Treasury told them they didn't put up inflation last time, and in fact, they put downward pressure on inflation. So they've gone back to the same method in the hope that the same result will be the case. They reckon that this will not only stop inflation getting worse, but it'll take 0.5 percentage point off inflation, so they can stand hand on heart and say, we've been economically responsible in our giving you all this money, just before an election.
It's weird though, right? I mean, I understand that there's a mechanical procedure by which if you reduce people's energy bills, that reduces the CPI. So technically it reduces inflation. And I get it that consumer demand is very low. So, there's not a lot of pressure already in the system from consumers buying things on inflation. But put $3-4 billion effectively into the economy, like it's money people don't have to spend, and therefore they have to spend on other things, and it not being inflationary. I mean, I don't pretend to know better than the Secretary of the Treasury and the RBA, but it just feels a little counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, there's a little bit of crossing the fingers about it and hoping that people don't go out and spend the $300 that they're getting back, or that they're not having to spend on power bills. And they are leaning on the consumer spending figures. Consumption is down. We've heard from the Reserve Bank governor in the last week that people are nervous. There's obviously a sense of uncertainty in the economy and people are reluctant to spend. And in some ways, the government's kind of using that a bit.
Banking on that, yeah.
Yeah, we can hand back money in the knowledge people are a bit nervous about the economy and they won't spend it. They'll more likely save it.
I've also got questions, about the fact that the energy rebate is not means tested. I mean, I know they say, it's simpler, and I guess it is, but it was targeted last time and it isn't this time. And, this is a Labor government that says it can't afford to put up JobSeeker, but it can afford to give the wealthiest households in the country $300 for their energy bills. I mean, I have questions about that.
Yep. And when you ask the Treasurer about it, you get a really unsatisfactory response, which is just, everyone's paying more for their groceries and their power bills, so everyone deserves a bit of help, which is not really a very Labor response. You wouldn't expect them to, in other circumstances, not related to a looming election, to say something like that. But when you ask officials about it, the picture that is formed is really, it's kind of technically complicated to try and redesign the rebate system to include some people and not other people. So they've gone for the get it out fast, give it to everyone, get the maximum benefit. I mean, there's a downside risk there politically too, that people might go, hang on a minute, and just like Lenore said, why are all the rich people getting $300 as well as the people who really need it? And so, they're taking a risk, but they obviously need to get it out fast. They didn't want to just limit it to the people who got it last time, and this was the only alternative in the time frame.
But conversely, there's a political risk in creating losers. Like if you limit it, there's a cut-off point, and there's someone on the other side of that cut-off point that turns up on the front page of a paper saying, I wish I got it too. So I guess there's a political imperative in spreading it this widely as well.
And they've made the calculation that this way is going to hurt them less and gain them more than the other.
Labor's also celebrating 2 back-to-back surpluses, but things in the economy are far from rosy, aren't they?
Yeah, I think growth is sluggish. It's really sluggish, and we've got a year of a surplus and then we're back into deficit. So I think the economy is, you could say, anemic at best, and the government is sort of gambling that they're going to walk this line between spending and inflation, and that external factors, which are unpredictable and difficult. There's a couple of wars going on in the world. I mean, there is a possibility that there would be a new US president, by early next year who, might start having trade wars, which would impact our economy. And there's a lot of imponderables in this, and they're walking a very fine line. So, yeah.
And Karen, there are deficits as far as the eye can see beyond these surpluses, but obviously big spending over the years to come.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a precarious economy, and I think we have to remember that it's also a confidence game, handing down a budget. You're wanting to reassure the public that you've got things under control, and so there's a little bit of that going on. But really, the underlying story is pretty worrying. Lenore mentioned the global circumstances. The budget papers are really saying, look, they could create massive uncertainty and throw all of the forecasts out. And when you look back, I mentioned the Reserve Bank governor, when you look back at what she said last week, she's very frank, and she said, we're working hard to ensure that the economy doesn't tip into recession. She actually said the R word. So I think it's a fine line that the government is walking, as Lenore says, and they've got this political imperative, which they are very much leaning into, but they have to be super, super careful about what they do with the economy, and there's a lot that is still out of their control.
I want to talk about housing. We know there is an extreme housing shortage. The government wants to build 1.2 million houses in 5 years. Will the measures in this budget do that, Lenore, and is that even enough?
Well, it's not enough to keep up with demand, and it's very hard to say whether the measures in this budget will do it because all the measures are funneled through the states. So there's $1 billion to the states for sort of new housing developments for the sort of services around them. There's an extension for the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness, but again, it goes through the states. And it's up to the states to sort of deliver the spending, if you like. So there is more money for housing, as well as the rent assistance that we mentioned earlier. Exactly how quickly it will make a difference, I think is difficult to say.
I think that's right. And this spending is where they have targeted it more at the low end. So there's a great deal of emphasis in the budget measures on housing, on social housing and homelessness, and trying to alleviate the costs and create more housing at that end with the view that it eases pressure across the whole system. But there's still the question, as Lenore says, of whether they can get this done in the time frame. There's a lot of moving parts to these housing proposals, including the states.
Labor's Future Made in Australia plan has been in the headlines for a couple of weeks, but details have been thin. What more did we learn about it?
Well, we know a little bit more about the definitions they're going to use. It's still not very well spelt out.
It's a bit like wrestling smoke, let's be honest.
Honestly, it's done my head in, this thing, since it was announced. What is it? We kept saying, will be revealed. They kept saying, some has been revealed, nor some. So they've got these two categories where they're going to assess projects that might fit, whether they engage in net zero transformation, so whether they're directly involved in bringing down emissions to reach net zero, and whether they are involved in economic resilience and national security. Now, my spidey sense tells me that second one is a pretty broad category. It's still not clear whether this goes into any one portfolio, but it looks to me like they are keeping it as broad as possible, so they will make a judgment about which projects might fit within those definitions and be able to be labelled the Future Made in Australia. The emphasis is very much on kind of underwriting private investment rather than throwing public money at it. But having said that, there is scope to increase the public money for particular projects that we now have a set of benchmarks they would have to meet to be justifiable on public spending. But they've changed some of the rules around, for example, the export finance body that funded export finance projects will now be able to fund domestic projects as well. So there is some scope for using public money on what is essentially focused on clean energy technology and ostensibly is under the energy transformation banner.
Lenore, for those who haven't been following the Future Made in Australia announcement, what is it?
I thought I'd duck this one. Okay. Well, as Karen said, it is government tax incentives and in some cases subsidies for the kinds of industries that the government judges we really want to do here. So I guess things like renewable hydrogen, green metals, critical minerals like lithium and cobalt, clean energy, all those kinds of things. And in this period where it's been a bit like wrestling smoke, the government has been criticised for picking winners. These rules that will be legislated that Karen has just outlined, I guess, are its parameters. I mean, it is kind of picking winners, but they're the parameters for picking winners or the guidelines for picking winners. But there's still a bit of sort of smokiness about it, I got to say.
We'll be right back.
Hey, Jane Lee here with a quick note about The Guardian. As you probably know, Guardian Australia's journalism is editorially independent, which means we set our own agenda. We don't have a billionaire owner, we don't answer to shareholders, so we're free from commercial bias. And this independence matters because it means we're able to challenge the powerful and hold them to account. Unlike many news organisations, we haven't put up a paywall. We chose a model that means our reporting is open to everyone and funded by our readers and listeners who can afford to pay. Every contribution, whether big or small, counts. So if you're able to support us, head to theguardian.com/support full story. There's also a link on the full story page. Thanks.
So there is nearly $28 billion in savings.
Mm-hmm.
Where are they coming from?
So the biggest one is the NDIS, and it isn't actually an absolute cut to the NDIS, but a reduction in the increase in spending that was forecast over the forward estimates. And it's a reduction in that increase by about $14 billion. That is the financial impact, if you like, of the reforms Bill Shorten's been talking about for a while and the legislation that was introduced in March. And there's a consultation process going on with the recipients of NDIS funding about exactly how that will work. It is a big number, and I think there'll be a lot more debate about it, but it's a bit hard to say precisely from what's in the budget where those reductions in spending will fall.
There's also some more kind of optimistic savings in the tax domain as well. So like governments often do, they think they can reap billions of dollars back from cracking down on tax avoidance. I always think that's a slightly heroic idea. I know they get some, but the whole point about high wealth individuals and companies that are seeking to avoid tax is that they put a lot of energy into continually changing their arrangements to make sure that they do avoid the tax. So we'll see how they go on that. And there's also some changes to tax arrangements for foreign investors. So they are hopeful that they'll get some money back there. And in terms of reprioritisations, they're emphasising the announcements they made before the budget in the defence domain too. So a lot of where they had planned to be spending on defence, they're shifting the emphasis. So maybe keeping the envelope largely the same but spending on different things. So that's that euphemistic reprioritisation label that they've given to things.
So you've both already alluded to this. This budget has come at a time where we have an election on the horizon. How does this budget compare to other pre-election budgets?
Well, it's definitely got that pre-election vibe. I mean, I guess John Howard and Peter Costello used to be able to do bigger giveaways because they didn't have the same sort of inflation constraint that this government has. But, you know, we're certainly heading in the same direction. And I guess it's a gamble for the government in that if it does add to inflationary pressure, well, then all of the goodwill they're seeking to build with the Australian voting public will be pretty quickly undone. If it works and inflation doesn't rise and people do feel a little bit better with a tax cut and an energy rebate and whatever else,
and
then
the RBA doesn't increase cash rate,
then, you know, maybe it will work for them politically. But it is a very political budget.
And I note there are a lot of ifs in those sentences, which mean that there's a fair bit of wiggle room in there. To the point Lenore just made, people need to not only see that the figures are showing improvement, they need to feel better. And that's the great big challenge that the government faces. You know, part of the reason they revamped the coalition's proposed tax cuts and rebadged them and went ahead with them was because that the feedback they were getting from the electorate was that they felt that the measures that had been taken on cost of living relief didn't touch the sides. People just thought, you haven't done anything for me. So there's still a risk that they will look at this budget and say, what have you done for me? I'm still hurting. So it's a challenge for them to make sure that inflation, not only on paper but in its real-world impact, is coming down and people are feeling more secure, both economically and in the other sense. And I reckon that's a pretty big challenge for the government in the next 12 months. And it may mean that the election is sort of later rather than sooner. But if you leave it too late and you haven't achieved what you said you would, then you've got no room to move and people will punish you. So we'll see how they go.
Lenore, Karen, it's been a long day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Noel.
Thanks, Noor.